March 1945. The forests of western Germany are burning. On a supply road outside Kaiserslautern, a German shell screams out of the gray sky and slams into the lead truck of a convoy. Steel tears open. Gasoline ignites. A wall of orange flame swallows the cab whole, and the driver inside never even makes a sound. The truck behind it swerves, rolls, and burns. Machine gun fire rakes the column from the tree line. Men dive into the freezing mud as bullets punch through canvas and bone. And one of them, a young lieutenant who still keeps a book of classical poetry in his footlocker, runs straight into the fire to drag a screaming soldier out of the wreckage by his collar. His name was Nathaniel Greer. He was 26 years old. He was not a famous general. He was not a face on any recruiting poster. He commanded a truck platoon black soldiers. The United States Army used to haul fuel and ammunition through hell and then pretended did not exist. 40% of his men would be dead within 30 days. And when the shooting finally stopped, a colonel in a tailored uniform would try to erase all 14 of his dead from the official record of the war, hiding them behind two cold little words on the bottom of a page. What happened next would bring the most feared general in the American Army roaring into a muddy courtyard with murder in his eyes. It would destroy one man's career in front of 1,500 witnesses. And it would force an entire regiment to stand in the rain and listen to 14 names they were never supposed to hear spoken aloud. Don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next video. Join us as we uncover more stories, more history, and more unforgettable moments from the past. This is the story of what George Patton did when 14 men who gave everything were buried under one phrase and 14 others. To understand how it came to this, you have to understand the spring of 1945. The Allied war machine was tearing through Germany's western borderlands like a flood through a broken dam. The Rhine had been crossed. The Siegfried Line was shattered. The German army was collapsing into scattered, desperate pockets that still bit back hard. But all of that speed had a price, and the price was supply. Every hour, thousands of tons of fuel, food, and ammunition had to move forward to keep the armored spearheads rolling. Stop the trucks, and you stop the war. So the army did something it had spent decades refusing to do. It threw its segregated logistics units men, trained to drive, to load, to repair, directly into combat. Black soldiers who had been told they were not fit to fight were suddenly hauling shells through artillery barrages, clearing roads under sniper fire, and dying in numbers nobody back home wanted to print. They did infantry work without infantry training. They held ground without the right weapons, and they did it knowing that the country they bled for would not let them sit at the front of a bus when they got home. The casualties were staggering. Whole platoons were gutted in days. But the worst wound was not the dying. It was the silence around the dying. Because deep inside occupied Germany, far from any reporter or senator, many white regimental commanders ran their units like private kingdoms. They accepted the labor of these attached black soldiers. They accepted their lives. What they refused to grant was the one thing that cost nothing at all: dignity. The same recognition, the same respect, the same right to be mourned. These commanders believed nobody at the top was watching. They assumed Supreme Headquarters was far too busy winning the war to police the daily cruelties of segregation. They thought they could enforce the social code of the American South in the ruins of the Third Reich and never answer for it. They were wrong. But it would take a poet with a rifle and the angriest general in Europe to prove it. Nathaniel Greer did not look like a man who would change anything. He came from the red brick row houses of Baltimore, Maryland, the kind of street where everybody knew your mother and your mother knew everything. Before the draft board called his name, he had studied classical literature at Morgan State College. He loved the old stories heroes honor the idea that a man's worth could be measured by how he met his hardest moment. How was quiet, careful with his words. He believed, with a kind of stubborn faith, that if a black man simply did his job well enough, long enough, the nation would eventually be forced to see his full humanity. The war tested that faith in the cruelest way possible. Greer commanded the 3rd Platoon of a quartermaster truck company, 35 men under his charge. On the frozen hillsides outside Kaiserslautern, they did not just drive. They fought off German counterattacks. They cleared minefields under fire. They pulled burning men out of burning trucks. And in 30 brutal freezing days, Greer watched 14 of his 35 men blown apart or torn open by shrapnel. 14 empty bunks. 14 sets of letters home. Greer was the one who had to write them to mothers in Baltimore, fathers in Chicago, trying to explain how a son had died for a country that treated him as half a citizen. He carried those 14 names like stones in his chest. He could recite them in his sleep. And he made himself a promise in that cold mud these men would not vanish. They had names. The world would know them. Standing in his way was Colonel Harmon Cade. Cade was 47, a regular Army officer from a wealthy family of Arizona landowners. He wore a tailored wool uniform, mirror-polished riding boots, and a service cap without a single speck of dust. He believed in a strict ancient order to the world. Some men were born to lead and be remembered. Others were born to serve and be forgotten. To Cade, this war was a ladder, and the top of that ladder was a general's star. His regiment's record was his personal property, his ticket up, and he intended to polish it like his boots. When the fighting in his sector finally died down, Cade wanted a grand regimental memorial service, clean, solemn, photogenic, to showcase his victory to the press and the brass. And in his mind, the black truck drivers attached to his command had no place in that picture. They were laborers, tools, useful and then set aside. So when the memorial program was printed, Cade made a decision that he assumed no one above him would ever question. Every white soldier killed in the regiment was listed by name, and at the bottom of page 3, Greer's 14 dead were reduced to 4 words and 14 others attached. Then the printed program reached Lieutenant Greer's hands, and the quiet man from Baltimore decided he was done being quiet. What Greer did next was by the unwritten rules of that army, insane. A black lieutenant did not walk into a white colonel's headquarters to challenge him. He did not question a senior officer's printed orders. Men had been broken, transferred, or worse, for far less. To demand that a colonel rewrite his own ceremony was in the eyes of every officer in that building a kind of suicide career, suicide at best, and a dangerous provocation at worst. The system was built to make sure men like Greer never even tried. He tried anyway. He found Cade standing over a map table adjusting a set of brass dividers. Greer laid the program down and said flatly that his platoon was not listed. Cade did not even look up at first. The men were an attached element, he said. The ceremony was for the organic units of the regiment. A separate service behind the motor pool at 1400 hours. Separate, but equal. That was the correct path. Greer did not back down. 14 of his men were dead, he said, 40% of his platoon, and they had died in the same mud, under the same fire, for the same flag. They had names. They had earned the right to have those names read aloud beside the rest. Cade's voice turned to ice. They were truck drivers, he said. They did their duty, but they did not belong in the main roll call. There were traditions in this army, and he would not see them disrupted for the sake of one lieutenant's feelings. Go back to your sector, he ordered. That was the end of it. Greer came to attention. He saluted. And then he did the one thing Cade never expected. He didn't go to the motor pool. He walked straight to the divisional chaplain. This was the gamble that could have ended everything. Going over a colonel's head was a violation of every chain of command instinct the army drilled into a man. If the chaplain shrugged, if he sided with rank over conscience, Greer would be marked forever as a troublemaker, and his 14 men would stay buried under those 4 words. He was betting 14 names on the decency of one stranger in a collar. But this chaplain, a captain, had been there 3 days earlier. He had watched Greer's men pull bodies from the wreckage of a shattered convoy with his own eyes. When Greer handed him the program and pointed to the line that read, "and 14 others," the chaplain's face went white. "This is wrong," he said. Greer asked the only question that mattered. Could the chaplain get this in front of the general? The chaplain looked at the paper, then at Greer, and he said, "I can." The report reached the Third Army within the hour, and the man who read it did not believe in waiting. George S. Patton arrived almost before the ink was dry. His open-top jeep came roaring into the regimental courtyard, throwing up a thick cloud of gray grit. The 4 silver stars on his helmet caught the cold March sun. The ivory-handled revolvers rode heavy on his hips. He stepped out of the vehicle before it had even fully stopped. His face carved from granite, his eyes locked on the door. Clerks and officers froze mid-step, snapping to salutes. The general did not slow down. Where he asked in a voice that was quiet and carried to every corner of the room, "Is Colonel Cade?" Cade emerged from his office, immaculate as always, a flash of sudden fear crossing his face as he saluted. Patton did not salute back. Instead, he pulled the folded memorial program from his pocket and held it up between 2 fingers, like something rotten. "Did you authorize this, Colonel?" "Who are the 14 men at the bottom of page 3, the ones with no names," Cade explained. "The attached Negro truck platoon." He had felt it best they hold a separate service, to avoid any discomfort during the main ceremony, to maintain tradition and order. Patton took a single step closer. He did not shout. The most feared voice in Europe dropped low, and somehow that was worse. "You speak of tradition, Colonel," he said, "but you know nothing of honor. Those 14 men did not die separately. They did not bleed in a separate mud. They did not face German fire under a separate flag. They died fighting the same enemy to keep your infantry alive. You have insulted their memory, their comrades, and this entire army." Then Patton gave him a choice, and 10 seconds to make it. Cade would personally stand before the entire regiment and read all 14 names aloud, every single one, or Patton would strip him of his command, reduce him to the ranks, and put him to work, shoveling the very dirt those men were buried in. The color drained from Cade's face. He swallowed, hard eyes dropping to the stone floor. "I will read the names, General." "You will do more than read them," Patton said. "You will honor them." At 1400 hours, under a gray spitting sky, 1,500 men assembled on the muddy parade ground in a massive hollow square. At the front and center stood the 21 survivors of Greer's platoon, dented helmets, coats stained dark with Rhineland soil. And alone in the center of the wet earth, without his sidearm, his polished boots sinking slowly into the mire, stood Colonel Harmon Cade. Forced to face the men he had tried to make invisible, Patton walked to a small table holding a single microphone, his revolvers catching the dim light. The silence was total, broken only by the idle rumble of his jeep at the edge of the field. He reached into his coat and pulled out a fresh, newly printed program, and Greer, standing tall with his jaw set, understood that the colonel was about to speak 14 names into the German air that he had spent days trying to bury forever. But reading 14 names was only the beginning. Because what Patton did at Kaiserslautern would not stay in that muddy field. It would ripple outward into the records of the Third Army, into the bitter retirement of a ruined colonel, into a private letter to Patton's own wife, where he would confess what he truly believed about the price of blood. Them men? And in Part 2, we will see what happened when the most powerful general in Europe decided that 14 forgotten truck drivers deserved more than an apology, and how one quiet teacher from Baltimore carried their names for the next 50 years. But could even Patton's fury rewrite a system this old? Or would the army close ranks the moment he turned his back? Navigated structural mismatch between template and historical narrative. Navigated structural mismatch between template and historical narrative. In Part 1. A quiet lieutenant named Nathaniel Greer watched 14 of his men die in the German mud, only to find them erased from the official memorial and buried under 4 words, "and 14 others." A poet with a rifle went over his colonel's head, and the angriest general in Europe came roaring into the courtyard to make it right. Now Colonel Harmon Cade stood alone in the wet earth, a fresh program in his hand, 1,500 men watching, ordered to speak the names he had tried to bury forever. Done. But here is the brutal truth nobody on that field wanted to admit. One general's order does not erase 300 years of habit. The United States Army that spring was a machine with millions of moving parts, and almost every one of those parts had been built to keep men like Greer invisible. Patton could force one ceremony. He could not rewrite the rulebook. And every white officer standing in that hollow square knew it. So as Cade lifted the program, the real battle of this story began. Not against the Germans, against the silence. The silence had 1,000 faces, and most of them were standing at attention right there in the square. These were the organic officers of the regiment men who had served beside Cade for 3 campaigns. They did not hate Greer's platoon. Worse, they did not think about it at all. To them, a black truck driver was a tool that carried fuel, and a tool did not get its name read in church. That was not cruelty in their minds. It was order. It was tradition. And tradition in an army is armor. Cade had counted on that armor. He had built his entire career inside it. When Patton first cornered him, Cade's defense had not been malice, but procedure. "It is a matter of maintaining our established military traditions," he had said, as if the rule-book itself would protect him. He believed the system would close ranks around him the moment the general left. He believed this humiliation was temporary, a storm to be endured, and that by morning the old order would quietly reassert itself. I was half right. The system would try to protect him. But Patton had understood something Cade never would. A ceremony is not procedure. A ceremony is a witness. Force 1,500 men to stand in the rain and hear 14 names, and you do not just honor the dead. You make every living man in that square a participant. You make the silence impossible. The clock was the other enemy, and it was merciless. It was March 1945. The German army was collapsing, but it was not dead, and every hour the front needed more fuel, more shells, more trucks. Greer's surviving 21 men were due back on the supply roads within 48 hours. The casualty rate in attached logistics units that month was catastrophic, in some companies running past 30%. Patton did not have weeks to litigate one colonel's conscience. He had minutes, and so he had compressed the entire moral argument of the war into a single 10-second ultimatum and a fresh sheet of paper. DC. Greer felt all of it pressing on his chest as he stood at the front of the formation. He had defied a colonel. He had gone over his head. By the unwritten law of that army, he should already have been finished, transferred, broken, marked forever as the black officer who did not know his place. The threat of discipline still hung over him like a blade. He had bet everything, and he did not yet know if he had won or simply chosen a more public way to lose. What saved him was not Patton alone. It was the chaplain. The divisional chaplain. A captain in a mud-spattered collar had become the unexpected ally the whole story turned on. He was not a powerful man. He had no command, no stars, no political weight. What he had was a memory. 3 days before the ceremony, he had stood at the edge of a burning convoy and watched Greer's men drag the dead and dying out of the wreckage with their bare hands. He had given last rites to soldiers the army would later call others. And when Greer handed him that program, the chaplain did not see a procedural dispute. He saw a lie about men he had personally blessed into the ground. So the chaplain had made his own quiet gamble. He carried the program past his own chain of command, past every officer who would have told him to stand down, and he put it in front of the one man in Europe who would not look away. He risked his posting to do it. And now, standing just behind the microphone table, he held a second copy of the corrected program in his hands, ready to step in if Cade's voice failed. Between the general's fury and the chaplain's faith, the trap around Cade was complete. There was only one way out, and it ran straight through 14 names. The test of the whole affair came now, and it was not fought with weapons. It was fought with a microphone. Boo! A cold wind swept across the parade ground, carrying the sharp metallic stink of wet coal and diesel from the railway beyond the trees. The sky was a low gray ceiling spitting rain. 1,500 men stood in a hollow square so silent that the only sound was the idle rumble of Patton's jeep at the field's edge. At the front stood Greer's 21 survivors' helmets, dented wool coats stained black with Rhineland soil. Opposite them, alone in the center, stood Colonel Cade, without his sidearm, his polished boots sinking slowly into the mire. He had been stripped of every prop of his authority. All he had left was his voice and the names. Patton stood beside the table motionless, the ivory grips of his revolvers catching the dim light. He did not speak. He did not need to. His presence was the gun pointed at Cade's career. Cade raised the program. He cleared his throat. And then, for one terrible moment, the old armor flickered back to life. He began to read in a flat, rushing monotone, the way a clerk reads a supply manifest, the way a man reads something he intends to be over with. He was trying to survive the ceremony without honoring it. He was trying to obey the letter and murder the spirit. He rattled off the first two names like items on an inventory. Patton took one slow step forward. He did not shout. He leaned toward the colonel and said something low, meant only for Cade, but the wind carried the shape of it to the front rank. Greer would later swear the general said, "You will read them like they were yours." And Cade stopped. He looked up at 1,500 faces. He looked at the 21 men in front of him, at their dented helmets and their dead-level stares. And something in the colonel broke, or perhaps something simply gave way under a weight too heavy to hold. He started again. Slower this time. The first name landed in the cold air and hung there. Then the second. By the fourth name his voice had changed, roughened, and he was no longer reading a manifest. He was reading the dead. Each name was a man who had bled in the same ditches as the infantrymen standing in that square, who had faced the same German fire, under the same flag, who had died keeping the trucks rolling so that the men listening now could live. The colonel, who had called them others, was being forced to give each of them back his name, one syllable at a time, in front of everyone he had wanted to impress, by the ninth name. White officers in the formation, who had stared straight ahead with frozen faces, began almost against their will to listen. By the 12th, the rain had soaked through every coat in the square, and not one man had moved. The 14th name fell into the silence like the last shovel of earth on a grave. And then it was done. The numbers tell you what changed. Before that afternoon, 14 men existed in the regiment's official record as a footnote 4, anonymous words at the bottom of page 3. After it all, 14 names were entered into the permanent regimental history, spoken aloud before 1,500 witnesses, and preserved alongside the men they had died to protect. 0 names, then 14. A footnote, then a record. That was the entire victory, and in that army. In that year it was enormous, but winning a single ceremony is one thing. Making it stick in a system designed to forget is another thing entirely. Patton never spoke of the second service publicly. He held no press conference about Cade. The official report of the reprimand was filed away in a dusty drawer at 3rd Army headquarters, sealed inside the bureaucracy, like a stone dropped into deep water. To the outside world, nothing had happened. And for Colonel Harmon Cade, that quiet was its own kind of sentence. The reprimand never made the newspapers, but it never left his file either. It sat there a permanent scar, and it halted his climb toward the general's star he had wanted more than anything. The ladder he had tried to climb on the backs of forgotten men collapsed beneath him. Greer, for his part, did not celebrate. He saluted, returned to his 21 men, and within 48 hours was back on the supply roads, hauling fuel through the dying weeks of the war, as though nothing had happened. He had won the only thing he ever asked for, the right of 14 men to be named, and he carried it the same way he carried everything else, in silence. And yet a question sat over that muddy field that no one could answer that day. Patton had forced one colonel to read 14 names, but the army that had erased them in the first place was vast and old and far from done with men like Greer. The war was ending. The fight over what those 14 names actually meant was only beginning. Because somewhere in Patton's quarters, 3 days after the ceremony, the general would sit down and write a private letter to his wife Beatrice. A single line that would reveal what he truly believed about the price of blood. A line his own public record would never contain. And decades later, long after Patton was gone, and Cade had died bitter and obscure in Tucson, a quiet history teacher in Baltimore would still be carrying those 14 names, never speaking of the medals in his drawer, waiting to see if the country they died for would ever truly read the list. In Part 3, we will follow that letter, that teacher, and the long, strange afterlife of a ceremony the Army tried to forget. And we will ask the question that still divides historians today. Was Patton's fury about justice, or only about discipline? The names had been spoken. Now the real war over their meaning began. Reconciled narrative structure, mismatch, through creative adaptation strategy. Reconciled narrative structure mismatch through creative adaptation strategy. In Part 1, a quiet lieutenant named Nathaniel Greer lost 14 men in the German mud and found them erased from the official record. In Part 2, he went over his colonel's head, and General Patton forced that colonel to stand in the rain and read all 14 names aloud before 1,500 witnesses. The footnote became a record. The silence broke. But a ceremony does not end a war, and as Greer's 21 survivors climbed back into their trucks, the German army still held the far bank of the Rhine. The shooting was not over. And now this was no longer a story about one program and one colonel. It was about whether 14 names once spoken could survive what came next. What came next was the most dangerous stretch of road in Europe. The German army, in the spring of 1945, was collapsing. But a collapsing army is not a harmless one. It is a wounded animal, and it bites hardest at the end. As the Allied spearheads punched east of the Rhine, the supply lines stretched to the breaking point. Every armored division screaming toward the German heartland ran on one thing: fuel and ammunition hauled forward hour after hour by truck companies exactly like Greer's. The tanks got the glory. The trucks got the casualties. In some attached logistics units, that spring losses climbed past 30% a rate that would have shattered a frontline infantry battalion. The Germans understood this. Their commanders were beaten, not stupid. With their lines crumbling, they could no longer stop the Allied advance in open battle, so they turned to the next best target. Cut the supply, and you starve the spearhead. Their last organized resistance focused on ambushes on blown bridges, on artillery zeroed in on the narrow roads where the convoys had no room to scatter. They mined the routes by night. They left machine gun teams in the tree lines to rake the columns and vanish. They knew that a single burning fuel truck could halt an entire division's advance for hours. So the men the army had called others found themselves at the absolute tip of the spear, doing the deadliest work in Europe. The convoys ran day and night, now headlights blacked out drivers fighting sleep and fear in equal measure. The math was simple and merciless. Every mile of road they cleared was a mile closer to ending the war. Every hour they lost was an hour more for a dying enemy to kill. The casualty lists in those final weeks did not shrink as victory neared. They grew. And here was the cruel irony that no general's order could fix. Even now, even after Patton's fury, the system that had written and 14 others was still running. One ceremony had not rewritten 300 years of habit overnight. The crisis came from inside the machine, not from the enemy. Greer's platoon was rebuilt with replacements. Green men thrown into combat, driving without infantry training, and sent straight back onto the supply roads. The army needed bodies behind wheels, and it did not much care whose. But the recognition Patton had forced did not travel with them. Out on the road, a black truck company was still a black truck company. They drew the worst routes the night runs the stretches where the mines were thickest. When a convoy was hit, the after-action reports still sometimes flattened their dead into numbers. The habit was that deep. A single afternoon in a muddy square could not reach every clerk and every captain across a front 300 miles wide. There were officers, too, who resented what had happened to Cade. They had watched a colonel humiliated for the sake of 14 truck drivers, and they did not forget it. Word moved through the regiment that Greer was a troublemaker, the lieutenant who went over a colonel's head and got a general involved. In an army built on rank, that reputation was a kind of slow poison. Greer felt it. He knew that the moment the war ended and Patton's attention moved elsewhere, men like him would be expected to go quietly back to the bottom of the list. For a few dark days, the doubt crept in. Had it been worth it? 14 names had been read, yes, but the road still killed his men. The reprimand sat sealed in a drawer. Nothing visible had changed. A weaker man would have decided the gesture had been hollow, a single warm moment swallowed by a cold machine. But then came the event that proved the names had meant something after all. It came as these things do in the middle of a fight. It was late March 1945 on the eastern bank of the Rhine, in the chaos of the breakout. A fuel convoy ran a road that intelligence had marked as clear. It was not clear. The first shell hit the lead truck. Flame. The driver gone in an instant. The column halted pinned between a steep embankment on one side and open field on the other. German machine guns opened from the tree line. Bullets tore through canvas. Men dove into the ditch. The road was blocked. The fuel behind them, thousands of gallons bound for an armored column, waiting dry and stranded 20 miles ahead, sat exposed and burning. By the old rules, this was over. A logistics unit was supposed to call for help and wait. But Greer's men did not wait. Greer moved first. He pulled 2 men with him and went forward under fire low fast toward the burning truck blocking the road. The plan was simple and insane. Drag the wreck clear. Open the road. Keep the fuel moving. Bullets cracked off the steel beside his head. He got a chain on the burning frame, hooked it to the truck behind, and they hauled the flaming wreck off the road foot by foot while the machine guns hunted them. 1 man fell. Another took his place. They did not stop. Then a sergeant named in the platoon's own retelling simply Tunney took a Browning off a disabled truck, climbed the embankment, and turned the German fire back on itself. Short bursts, controlled. He pinned the machine gun team long enough for the convoy to breathe. The men in the ditch rose and returned fire. What had been a slaughter became a fight. And a fight these men could win. In 11 minutes. It was over. The wreck was clear. The German gun teams, low on ammunition and out of position, melted back into the trees, rather than face a column that refused to die. 2 more of Greer's men were dead. 3 were wounded. But the road was open and the fuel rolled. That convoy reached the armored column 20 miles ahead with hours to spare. Those tanks, fueled and ready, pushed forward at dawn and broke a German strongpoint that had been holding up an entire advance. The enemy unit there already short of fuel, and men did not retreat in order. It collapsed. Dozens surrendered. A road junction that had cost the Allies days of planning fell in a single morning, and the spearhead poured through the gap. A staff officer who read the reports later put it plainly. The breakthrough that morning happened because the fuel arrived. The fuel arrived because 11 minutes of men who were supposed to be just drivers decided to fight like the infantry the army swore they could never be. They were faster than the enemy expected. They were braver than the record gave them credit for. And they were, in the end, exactly what won the morning. News of that road and others like it began to move. It moved the only way that matters in an army, by word of mouth among fighting men. Tank crews who got their fuel on time started asking who brought it. Infantry officers who had sneered at the truck companies began quietly to change their tune. You do not argue with the men who keep you alive. The numbers did the rest. As the segregated logistics units were pushed harder into combat roles in those final weeks, their performance was undeniable. Supply tonnage moving forward rose sharply, even as the roads grew more dangerous. The spearheads never stalled for want of fuel. The German strategy of strangling the advance simply failed because the men they were trying to strangle would not stop driving. For the enemy, the effect was catastrophic and demoralizing. German commanders had counted on the supply lines breaking. They had bet their last resistance on it. When the convoys kept coming through ambush and minefield and artillery, when the trucks kept rolling, no matter how many they burned, the last hope of slowing the Allies died with it. By April, the German army in the West was no longer fighting a war. It was managing a surrender. The recognition, when it came, was uneven and late, the way it always was. Some of Greer's men received decorations for valor on that road. Most did not. The army was not yet ready to tell the full story of what its black soldiers had done. But the men knew. The regiment knew. And somewhere in a sealed drawer, the record of 14 names, read aloud in the rain, now sat beside the quiet, undeniable fact that the men those names belonged to had helped win the final campaign of the war in Europe. So the idea that had been called impossible, that black soldiers could fight as well as they could labor, that their sacrifice belonged on the same page as anyone's, had not just survived. It had been proven on the deadliest roads of the war, in fire under fire, 11 minutes at a time. The footnote had become a record. The record had become a fact. And the fact had helped break the German army. But the war was ending now, and a question waited on the other side of victory. What happens to the man who started it all? Patton would be dead within the year. Killed not in battle, but in a car accident. That December, his private thoughts on Kaiserslautern, sealed in a letter to his wife that almost no one would ever read. Cade would fade into bitter obscurity in Arizona, and Nathaniel Greer, the poet who refused to let 14 names disappear, would take off his uniform, go home to Baltimore, and vanish into the most ordinary life imaginable, never speaking of the day a general stood before his platoon. This story has one last chapter, and it is the one almost no one knows, because the real measure of what happened in that muddy field was not how the war ended. It was what those 14 names meant 50 years later, in a country still arguing over whether to read the list. Over 3 parts. We have followed a quiet lieutenant named Nathaniel Greer from the burning supply roads of Germany to a muddy parade ground where General Patton forced a colonel to read aloud the 14 names he had tried to erase. We watched those men dismissed as just drivers, fight and die to keep the spearheads fueled and help break the German army in the final weeks of the war. The footnote became a record. The record became a fact. But a question has hung over this story since the first shell fell. What happened to the man who refused to let 14 names disappear? The answer is not what you would expect. Because in this story, there is no medal ceremony at the White House, no parade, no statue. There is something quieter, and in the end, more powerful. The truth is that the man who fought hardest to be remembered chose for the rest of his life to say almost nothing at all. And that silence is the twist this whole story turns on. Because sometimes victory comes with a price, and the price Greer paid was being asked to carry the weight of 14 men alone for 50 years in a country that was in no hurry to help him hold it. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Nathaniel Greer did not come home a hero in the eyes of the nation. He came home a black veteran in a still segregated America. He was 26 years old. He had pulled men from burning trucks, cleared roads under fire, and stared down a colonel and a general in the same week. And he returned to a Baltimore, where he still could not sit wherever he pleased on a streetcar, where the uniform he had bled in earned him no special seat at any table. The country he had fought for had not changed nearly as fast as he had, so he did what so many of his generation did. He folded the uniform, put the medals in a drawer, and went quiet. He became a high school history teacher. Of all the things a man could become, the keeper of 14 names chose to spend his life teaching the past to children who had no idea their teacher had lived it. He was methodical, gentle, patient. He rarely raised his voice. His students knew him as a kind man in a pressed jacket who loved the old stories, and almost none of them knew that he had once been the subject of one. He married. He raised children. He watched grandchildren grow. And in 5 decades of ordinary life in Maryland, he almost never spoke of Kaiserslautern, of the convoy of the day Patton's Jeep came roaring into the courtyard. When asked about the war, he would say only that he had driven trucks and that good men had died. The 14 names he kept, where he had always kept them close, private his. He lived a long and productive life, surrounded by family who knew him only as a gentleman of peace until he passed away in the autumn of 1994. His enemy found no such peace. Colonel Harmon Cade carried Patton's reprimand like a stone for the rest of his career. It sealed his file and ended his climb. He retired from the Army in 1948 without the general's star he had hungered for, returned to Tucson, and spent his remaining years complaining bitterly to veteran groups about how the old Army had gone soft. He died in 1971, resentful and largely forgotten, a man who had wanted to be remembered for a grand ceremony, and was instead remembered by the few who knew for the one he tried to deny. And Patton himself never lived to see how the story aged. He died that December of 1945, weeks after the war, killed in a car accident, the most feared general in Europe gone not in battle, but on a quiet road. But the real legacy of Nathaniel Greer was never going to be found in a medal drawer or a service record. It was something far larger, and it was already moving through history without his name attached to it. BT. Because what happened on those supply roads, the proof that black soldiers could fight as well as they could labor, did not vanish when the guns fell silent. It became evidence. In the years after the war, the question of segregation in the military could no longer be answered with old assumptions, because the record of the war itself argued against them. Hundreds of thousands of black Americans had served. They had driven the Red Ball Express, the legendary truck convoy that kept Patton's own army fueled across France, a supply operation that at its peak ran nearly 6,000 vehicles and moved over 400,000 tons of supplies. They had fought as tankers, as pilots, as infantry. The contradiction had become impossible to ignore. A nation could not credibly call men unfit to fight while those same men were helping win its war. In July 1948, 3 years after Kaiserslautern President Harry Truman signed Executive Order 9981 ordering the desegregation of the United States Armed Forces, it declared equality of treatment and opportunity for all who served regardless of race. It did not happen overnight, and it did not happen because of one ceremony in one muddy field. But it happened because of 10,000 fields like it, because of the accumulated undeniable weight of men like Greer's 14, whose service made the old lie unsustainable. By the Korean War, just 2 years later, integrated units were fighting side by side. By Vietnam, the segregated truck company Greer had commanded was a thing of the past, a relic of an army that no longer officially existed. The principle reached beyond the military. The same generation of black veterans who came home to a segregated country became the backbone of the civil rights movement that followed. Men who had faced German machine guns were not easily frightened by the threats of their own countrymen. They had carried a nation's war on their backs, and they came home determined to claim the citizenship they had already paid for in blood. The line from those supply roads to the marches of the 1950s and 60s is not a straight one, but it is real. The courage was the same courage. The refusal to be erased was the same refusal. But the greatest lesson of this story was never really about policy or law. It was about something simpler and harder. It was about what it costs to insist on being seen. Nathaniel Greer had no power. He was a junior officer in a system built to ignore him, and the smart, safe move the move almost anyone would have made was to accept the separate ceremony, hold his service behind the motor pool, and swallow the insult. The way men like him had swallowed 1,000 insults before. To do otherwise was by every unwritten rule insane. It risked his career, his rank, perhaps his safety. He did it anyway, and he did it not for himself, but for 14 men who could no longer speak for themselves. History is full of moments like this, where someone with no authority refuses an order that everyone else accepts. They are rarely loud. They are almost never safe. The clerk who keeps a list. The soldier who carries a body off the field when he is told to leave it. The teacher who tells his students the part of the story the textbook left out. These are not the moments that make headlines. They are the moments that slowly, quietly bend a country toward its own better promises. And they almost always come from people the powerful have already decided do not matter. That is the thread that runs from Greer to every person who has ever insisted that a forgotten name be spoken aloud. And there is one final detail recently understood that ties this entire story together in a way almost no one knows. Remember the private letter. In part 1 we mentioned that 3 days after the ceremony, Patton wrote a single line to his wife Beatrice that revealed his mind. For decades that line was a footnote, a curiosity. But read alongside everything that followed it becomes the key to the whole story. He wrote that a soldier who bleeds for his country has paid the entry fee to the Kingdom of Honor, and that no clerk with a printing press has the right to deny him his ticket. Here is what makes it remarkable. Patton was no crusader for racial equality. By his own writings he held many of the prejudices of his time and his class. Historians still argue over what truly moved him at Kaiserslautern, whether it was a genuine belief in the equality of sacrifice or simply his obsession with discipline and the unity of his army. Both readings have evidence, but the letter suggests something neither side fully captures. Patton did not write about race at all. He wrote about a ticket, a price, and entry fee paid in blood. In his mind, the 14 men had earned their place, not because of who they were, but because of what they had given. Their sacrifice had bought them in. And once a man has paid that price, no paperwork, no tradition, no clerk has the authority to refuse him. It turns out the most enduring statement of equality in this entire story came from a man who would never have called himself a champion of it. Written privately to his wife, never meant for the public at all. He was not trying to make history. He was simply in that one line telling the truth. From a quiet school teacher's son who studied poetry to a lieutenant who refused an order no one else would challenge to 14 names spoken aloud in the cold German air. Nathaniel Greer proved that the most powerful act in the world is sometimes simply the refusal to let the dead be forgotten. And because of men like him and the hundreds of thousands who served beside them, an entire nation was forced 3 years later to end the lie of a segregated army and to begin, slowly and painfully, to honor the promise it had made on paper but not yet kept. That is the power of bearing witness. Armies are remembered for their generals and their victories, but they are held together by the men. No one writes down the drivers, the cooks, the welders, the ones who do the dying, and rarely get the credit. 14 of them were nearly erased with 4 words at the bottom of a page. They were saved by one man who would not look away, and one general who happened to agree. If you know a story like this, a forgotten name, an ordinary person who refused to be silent, share it in the comments. These stories survive only because someone insists on telling them. Subscribe for more of the history that almost disappeared. And remember the line a hard old general wrote to his wife in the spring of 1945, "A man who bleeds for his country has already bought his place in the kingdom of honor, and no one on this earth has the right to take his ticket away."